growing up, I was never enough. My parents, especially my dad, seemed to delight in pointing out my flaws, sharpening their words like knives. "Why can't you be more like Jake?" was a refrain I heard often, and it wasn't just my father. My mom would add her own sharp commentary, one-liners that seemed to bounce off the walls long after they were spoken. "You're too sensitive," she'd say, rolling her eyes whenever I looked hurt. They called it teasing, but it never felt that way to me. It was criticism wrapped in a smile, a constant reminder that I was somehow less than they wanted. I learned quickly to keep my head down, to smile even when I felt the sting of their words, because showing any vulnerability only fed the fire. Jake, my older brother, was different. He was everything they wanted: athletic, outgoing, successful. It wasn't that he didn't know what was happening. I saw it in the guilt that flashed across his face when he caught me staring, when he heard the comments that I couldn't stand up to. But he was trapped too, caught between being the golden child and trying to protect me without ever stepping too far out of line. And so, we both settled into our roles, him as the perfect son and me as the perpetual disappointment. It was in college that I finally started to breathe. It was like stepping out from under a shadow that had loomed over me for years. I was studying literature, working part-time at a small bookstore in the city, and finally starting to see myself as more than just their punchline. That's when I met Daniel. He was a photographer, passionate and wild, with a spirit that felt as untamed as the city itself. We started talking during late-night shifts at the bookstore, bonding over our favorite books and stories. He was easy to be around, and with him, I didn't have to pretend. He listened when I spoke, and for the first time, I felt seen. Our friendship turned into something more. There was no big moment, no grand declaration. It just happened, like the slow blooming of a flower. Daniel understood me in a way that no one else ever had, and it wasn't long before I knew that he was the one. When he asked me to marry him, standing under the soft glow of streetlights, my answer was immediate. Yes. As the wedding day approached, I found myself caught between excitement and a deep, unsettling apprehension. I knew the day would be beautiful, with Daniel by my side and our closest friends there to celebrate. But I also knew that I couldn't invite my parents. The thought of them being part of it made my stomach turn. Their mockery, their inability to see me for who I truly was, it was too much. This day was supposed to be for us, not a stage for them to diminish me once more. I talked to Jake about it first. I needed him to understand why I made the decision. "I know it's hard," I said, my voice wavering. "But I can't let them be there. Not now, not ever." Jake's face fell, and for a moment, I saw that flicker of conflict cross his features. He opened his mouth to say something, then paused, running a hand through his hair. "Ella, I get why you're doing this. But they're still our parents. Don't you think this is something you'll regret?" I shook my head, refusing to let the doubt creep in. "I can't, Jake. I need this to be about me, about Daniel, about what we're building together. If I let them in now, it'll just be another chance for them to hurt me." He nodded, but the silence between us was heavy. "I understand," he said finally. "I just thought you should know how much this is affecting them. They don't understand why you don't want them there." I tried to breathe through the ache in my chest. I didn't want to hurt them, but I also couldn't sacrifice my happiness. It was like trying to fit myself into a mold that had always been too small. And so, I chose myself and Daniel. The day of the wedding came, and everything fell into place. We chose an old, ivy-clad garden for the ceremony, a place that felt magical, untouched by the bitterness of my past. Daniel's smile when he saw me walking down the aisle was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I felt a surge of joy that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. For once, the day was mine. But even then, the ghosts of my past lingered. I could feel them in the quiet moments when I caught Jake's eyes across the room, or when I heard whispers among the guests about why our parents weren't there. It was as if the space they would have occupied was pressing down on the celebration. The absence was loud, a reminder that making this choice wasn't simple or easy. It was a wound that stung every time I thought about it. Later that evening, Jake came to find me, his eyes apologetic. "I'm sorry, Ella. I didn't mean to put you in a difficult place. I looked at him and smiled, a real smile, one that felt like it could reach my eyes. It's okay, Jake. I know you're trying to be there for them, for me. I don't blame you. The night carried on with laughter and dancing. Daniel pulled me close, and for the first time in my life, I felt free from the weight of expectations and judgment. But when the celebration quieted down and the last of our friends said their goodbyes, the silence of the empty house that we'd returned to after the party reminded me that I'd made a choice that would stay with me forever. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The morning after the wedding, I woke up wrapped in a blanket of exhaustion and happiness. Daniel was still asleep beside me, his chest rising and falling in that rhythm I had come to know so well. The sun filtered through the window, casting warm patterns across the room, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I was allowed to be happy. But then the weight of reality settled back in. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I hesitated before picking it up. It was a message from Jake. We need to talk. My fingers tightened around the phone, heart thumping as I read the words. He'd been the one person I had trusted to understand my decision, but now it felt like a line had been crossed, and I was on the verge of losing the only bridge I had left to the family I had grown up in. I sat up, letting the blanket fall away, and glanced at Daniel. His eyes fluttered open, and he reached out, pulling me back into his arms. Hey, he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. Jake wants to talk, I said, the weight of the message pulling me down. Daniel's expression shifted, his usual warmth replaced with a look of quiet concern. Are you okay? Do you want me to go with you? I shook my head, leaning into his touch. No, I have to do this on my own. It's complicated. He nodded, understanding without needing me to say more. I took a deep breath, feeling the sting of regret mixing with my resolve. No matter what came next, I couldn't let my parents control me any longer. The air outside was crisp and sharp, like the edge of a blade, as I made my way to Jake's apartment. It was a small, modern space that he'd kept since college, and it was still littered with the remnants of the guy who never quite let go of his childhood. I knocked, and Jake opened the door, his face shadowed with the same tension I had felt when we last spoke. Hey, come in, he said, gesturing for me to step inside. The small living room was dim, the sunlight muted by the heavy curtains. He gestured to the couch, and I sat, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. Ella, I need you to understand that I'm not here to fight, Jake said, his voice low but steady. Mom and Dad have been calling me nonstop. They're devastated. I swallowed hard, my fingers twisting together in my lap. They've had their chance, Jake. I've spent my entire life trying to prove myself to them, trying to be enough. But it's never been enough, and I couldn't let them ruin one more important day of my life. Jake's expression softened, and he sat beside me. I know it's hard for you, but they're family. And I get it, I do. But cutting them out like this, it's not just going to hurt them. It's going to hurt you, too. You're my sister, Ella. I know we don't talk about it, but I care about you. And I hate seeing you torn between two worlds. The words stung, but they also made something inside me ache with the tiniest bit of hope. Jake wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, his own part in the ways my parents treated me, but he was here, now, trying to bridge the gap. I don't want to hurt them, I whispered. But I can't pretend like they never hurt me. He reached out, his hand hovering over mine before settling lightly on my fingers. I know, and I don't think anyone expects you to. But there's a way to move forward. There has to be. I looked at him, searching his eyes for any trace of the boy I used to know, the one who'd protect me when no one was watching. And there he was, buried under years of silence, but still there. I wanted to believe that there was a way to find some middle ground, something that didn't involve me going back to being their punching bag or losing my brother in the process. Maybe there is, I said, my voice gaining a bit of strength. But it's going to take time, Jake. They need to understand that what they did has consequences. I can't just go back and pretend everything is fine. He nodded slowly. That's fair. I think they need to understand that, too.
I don't want to lose you, Ella.
And I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between me and them. I felt a flicker of something, something that felt like relief mixed with sadness. He was right. This wasn't just about me. It was about the choices I made and how they rippled out to the people I cared about. And Jake, despite everything, was still someone I couldn't help but love. Tell me about them, Jake said after a moment. I want to know what they did that hurt you so much. The question caught me off guard, but it was exactly what I needed. I took a shaky breath and started to tell him about the years of biting remarks, the way their laughter never quite reached their eyes, how they would tell me I was too much or not enough, depending on their mood. I spoke about the times I'd come home from school with a winning grade only to hear, "So what? That's what's expected of you." Or the day I got my first art award, only for my dad to say, "What's the point if you can't make a living from it?" As I spoke, Jake's face shifted from concern to something darker. Anger, maybe, or understanding that he hadn't been aware of before. He listened, really listened, and for the first time, I felt like I was telling my story to someone who was hearing it. "I had no idea," Jake said softly, voice rough. "I'm sorry, Ella. I'm so sorry." A weight I didn't even know I was carrying began to lift. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. I wasn't alone in this anymore, even if my parents couldn't or wouldn't see it. "Do you think they'd listen if I talked to them?" Jake asked, his voice small but hopeful. I didn't know the answer, but for the first time, I was willing to try to find out. The days that followed were filled with a mix of relief and an undercurrent of apprehension. Jake and I began to talk more, not just about our parents or the past, but about everything. It was strange, almost like we were finally giving ourselves permission to reconnect after so many years. Daniel was supportive, never once questioning my choice or asking me to choose between him and my family. He understood, and his quiet strength was like a warm blanket on a cold night. A week after the wedding, Jake called me. His voice was steady, but I could sense the tension in his words. "Ella, I talked to Mom and Dad." I felt a pang of anxiety, like a rock had settled in my stomach. "And what did they say?" "They weren't shocked. They don't understand, but I think they're starting to." "Mom cried, Ella. And Dad, well, he didn't say much, but I think it's hitting him." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, staring at the wooden countertop, the grain running in all directions like the paths our lives had taken. I had spent so many years hoping for them to understand, and now that the possibility was real, it was almost overwhelming. "Do you think they'll come around?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake's reply was hesitant but hopeful. "I think they will, but it's going to take time. They're going to need to see you, to see what you've built with Daniel, how you've grown." It was hard to picture my parents sitting in a room with Daniel, my life partner, someone who had shown me that love didn't have to hurt. I couldn't shake the memory of their eyes, always cold and calculating when they looked at me. But I wanted to believe that Jake was right, that they could change, that I wasn't forever trapped in the story they had written for me. "I don't know, Jake," I said, my voice cracking. "I just don't want to be hurt again." "You won't be alone this time," Jake said. "I'll be there, and so will Daniel. We'll figure this out together." Over the next few days, I found myself preparing for the conversation that would change everything. Daniel and I talked about it, about what it would mean for us, and he listened as I voiced every fear, every doubt. "No matter what happens, we have each other," he reminded me, his fingers laced with mine. And for a brief moment, I felt like maybe, just maybe, this could work. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with strokes of orange and pink, Jake came over. He had a seriousness to him that I hadn't seen in years. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes told me everything. They were ready. My parents were ready to face the music. The next day, Jake and I drove to my parents' house. It was a sprawling home that had never felt like mine, filled with possessions that seemed to reflect their status and not their hearts. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning. My mom was in the kitchen, her back turned as she chopped vegetables. She turned when she heard us, her eyes wide with something I couldn't name. My dad sat in his chair, the one by the window where he always read the paper. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in years, and I saw a flicker of regret. It was there and gone in an instant, but it was enough to make my breath hitch. Ella, my mom said, her voice softer than I remembered. Jake. Hi, Mom, Jake said, his voice low but steady. I felt a sharp tug of emotion in my chest. He was the bridge between my world and theirs, and this moment was the culmination of years of silent battles. My dad set down the newspaper and stood up, the lines in his face deeper than I remembered. He was older now, and the years hadn't been kind to him. Ella, he said, voice hoarse, like he hadn't used it much. You look well. I'm happy, Dad, I said, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. But it was the truth. My mom's eyes shifted to Jake, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something in them, maybe hope or fear. We've been trying to understand, Ella. I think we've failed you, and I'm sorry, she said, and the tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. My father's voice cut in, softer, almost vulnerable. We didn't know how to see you, Ella. We were afraid that if we did, we'd lose what we thought we wanted. I know now that we lost you instead. Jake stepped forward, his hand reaching for mine. The air seemed to thicken, the past and present colliding in a moment that felt almost surreal. We're here now, he said, looking at them, then at me. And we want to be a part of it, whatever that means. It was my mother who broke the silence. Can we start over? She asked, her voice trembling. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I looked at Jake, then at Daniel, who had joined us moments later, his presence grounding me. I saw hope in Jake's eyes, a flicker that said he believed in second chances. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to believe it too. Yes, I said, the word like a key unlocking a door that had been shut for too long. But it's going to take time. My dad's face cracked with the smallest of smiles, one that made me realize how deep the ache in my heart had been. And as I stood there, with my brother and my parents, surrounded by the warmth of Daniel's hand in mine, I felt a fragile but real sense of healing begin to take root. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wouldn't erase the past. But it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, this was what it meant to come home. The days that followed were like stepping into uncharted territory. The walls between me and my parents that had taken years to build now seemed impossibly thin, and I wasn't sure whether to breathe a sigh of relief or hold my breath in fear of what might come next. Jake was a constant presence, a bridge that connected our worlds, but there were still moments when the silence threatened to consume me. My parents' attempts at understanding felt real, but it was only when the small gestures started that I dared to believe. One morning, just a few days after the initial conversation, I found a note slipped under my front door. It was from my mom, the handwriting familiar and shaky. Ella, we don't expect to be in your life again overnight, but we want to try. Love, Mom, it wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel read it with me, a smile tugging at his lips as he kissed my temple. This is good, Ella. It's a start. I held on to that note like a lifeline, trying not to think too much about the past, about all the years I'd spent battling to be seen. I spent more time with Jake, our bond slowly mending in the way only shared history could. One evening, as we sat in my small living room with takeout containers scattered on the coffee table, he looked at me, his eyes steady and sure. I know it's been hard for you, but they're trying, Ella. I've never seen them like this, Jake said, taking a bite of his pizza. Mom was looking at old photo albums the other day. She was crying. I glanced down, playing with the edge of my napkin. I don't know if it's enough, Jake. I'm scared that I'll let them back in, and it'll be like before. He reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. It's okay to be scared. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But if you want to try, you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and Daniel is too. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into my bones. The idea of trying wasn't as terrifying as I thought it would be. It felt like a path that had been paved just enough for me to take that first step. And when that first step turned into another, it started to feel less like a chore and more like something I wanted to do. The weekend after, we planned a small gathering at my place, something casual where the past and present could collide in a safe, controlled way. Jake had invited Mom and Dad, and I couldn't help but feel a nervous flutter when I thought about them coming over. When they arrived, it was different. My dad stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable, while my mom took in the apartment, eyes landing on the framed pictures of Daniel and me. I'd never seen her look at anything with such quiet contemplation. There was an awkwardness in the air, as if we were all waiting for the first domino to fall, for the past to burst through and shatter the fragile truce we were attempting to build. But instead, there were small, careful moments. My mom helped Daniel in the kitchen, offering to cut the vegetables while he finished the sauce. My dad stood by the window, staring out at the view, his hand resting on the sill as if he was grounding himself. It was the first time in my life I'd seen them like this, without the biting words or cold silences. When we sat down to eat, there were genuine conversations, the kind that were peppered with shared memories and careful questions. My mom asked about the art I'd been working on, a project that had taken weeks of meticulous effort. My dad, who had never shown interest in anything I created, leaned forward and said, "I saw that piece you did, the one with the blue and gold. It's beautiful." The air was thick with emotion, but there was also something hopeful, something I hadn't felt since I was a child, playing in the garden and dreaming of what it would be like to have parents who saw me. After dinner, we all moved to the living room. Jake put on an old record, the kind that filled the space with music and nostalgia, and I watched my mom tap her foot in time with the beat, a smile breaking across her face. It was fleeting, but it was there. And then, for the first time in years, my dad looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Ella, I don't expect you to forgive us, but I want you to know I'm sorry. I wish I could take back the years we lost." I don't think I realized how much I needed to hear those words until he said them. They weren't a perfect resolution, and they didn't erase the pain, but they were a balm to a wound I'd kept hidden for too long. I couldn't help the tears that welled up in my eyes as I nodded. I'm not sure what forgiveness looks like, but I'm willing to find out. There was a pause, and then Jake said, "It's a start, isn't it?" Daniel reached for my hand, giving it a squeeze, and I felt the warmth of his presence, like a steady flame in the background. The future was still uncertain, filled with questions and fears that I couldn't predict. But standing there, surrounded by the people who had been part of my story, some by blood, some by choice, I felt that for the first time in my life, I was allowing myself to move forward. The next few weeks were a delicate dance. There were moments of doubt, moments when old wounds throbbed and reminded me of what I'd endured. But there were also glimmers of hope, conversations that carried the weight of a second chance. I spent more time with my parents, this time on my terms. We visited them for dinner, shared stories, and talked about future plans. Jake and I began working on a project together, a small garden in their backyard, a symbol of growth, even in the face of years of neglect. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. But I started to see that there were new memories being created, memories that didn't have the sharp edge of my childhood. They were laced with laughter and honesty, with hope for what was yet to come. One evening, after a particularly meaningful dinner, my mom stood at the door as we were leaving. She looked at me, eyes glistening, and said, "Thank you for letting us back in, Ella. I don't know if I can make up for lost time, but I'll try." I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I realized that it was okay not to have all the answers. It was enough to try, to rebuild from the ruins, one brick at a time. And as Daniel and I walked back to our car, the streetlights casting a golden glow across the road, I felt that tiny, fragile seed of hope grow a little stronger. The past would always be part of me, woven into the fabric of who I was, but it no longer defined me. I had chosen this path, a path that led me to a place where forgiveness wasn't just an empty word but a possibility, a promise of what could be. And as the future stretched out before me, uncertain and full of potential, I knew that maybe, just maybe, the second chance I had always hoped for was finally within reach.